Jesus died on the cross, on the night when he was betrayed and went through so much of his passion. Before all of that unfolded, he gathered all of his disciples around him for one final meal. And in the course of that meal, he had some words to say to his disciples. You might say they were parting words, although not entirely so, because as we know, this was not the end of the relationship between these folks and Jesus. But nonetheless, important words that he shared with his friends, the disciples. We're going to read one portion of that last address, where Jesus says to his disciples, "As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be made complete. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I do not call you servants any longer, because the servant does not know what the master is doing. But I have called you friends, because I have made known to you everything that I've heard from my Father. You did not choose me, but I chose you. And I appointed you to go and bear fruit, fruit that will last, so that the Father will give you whatever you ask him in my name. I am giving you these commandments so that you may love one another." May God add a blessing to the reading and the hearing of the word. Amen. Well, today we're going to talk about love, which shouldn't surprise you as you heard the words of Jesus on his last night with his friends. But before we do so, I have to admit that one of the things I've discovered over the years is that preaching about love to an English-speaking congregation is very difficult. If there is a slipperier word in the English language than love, I don't know what it is. Love is something that we use to mean all sorts of things, doesn't it? It describes our trivial likes, but it also is used to describe how we feel about the deepest relationships that we have in our lives. We say, yes, I love vanilla ice cream, and I love my wife. Right? Yes. And I hope we mean something different when we say we love our partners than if we love ice cream. Although ice cream is pretty good. We use love in so many different ways, don't we? I love New York. I love your new haircut. I love that new clothing store. Now there's the ever-present red heart on bumper stickers that says, I heart my British or my English Setter Spaniel or whatever, or my pit bull. Most of our music is about love, whether it's Schubert or rock and roll or country. How many country fans do we have here? Somebody told me that country music, it's mostly not just about love, but about love's lost. You know, someone said if you play a country song backwards, you get your truck back, you get your dog back, and you get your girl back in that world. But
that's true.
Love is a slippery word, isn't it? It means so many things. And part of that for us who speak English is because of the the poverty of the English language. Other languages have more than one word for our single word of love. For Greek, for example, and probably most importantly, Greek, because it's the language of the New Testament. The New Testament was written in Greek. Greek has 3 words for love to our one. And those 3 words talk about the different shadings and gradations of love. There's eros, which is romantic love, and then there's phileos, which is brotherly love. It's like in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. And then there's agape love, which is divine love, and that's a love that is its character is different and deeper and more abiding than the kind of love that we find in eros and phileos. But we have in English only this one word, love, that doesn't really have a very clear meaning. And that can be a problem when we try to understand what the Bible is talking about when it talks about love. When Jesus talks about love, when Jesus commands us to love one another, what does he mean? Does that mean we should treat each other like our pet poodles? We love our poodles, after all, our pets. Does that mean we should be nice to each other? Does it mean we should have fond feelings towards one another? Or is it something deeper than that? Today we come to one of those passages where we need to listen deeply to try to fully understand what Jesus means when he commands us to love one another. Jesus talks a lot about love, but especially near the end of his ministry. His words, as recorded in John's Gospel, like I said, they came just after the Last Supper, when he had gathered his friends for a final meal, and before he's arrested and tried and convicted and killed on the cross. Love one another, he tells his friends, as part of his last words to them. But what does it mean? What does Jesus mean when he says you should love one another? As it turns out, the love Jesus is saying we should have towards one another is much deeper and more difficult than any of the other sorts of love that we talk about. But at least Jesus does us the favor of saying exactly what he means by loving one another. Listen to how he begins this teaching about love. He says, "As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you." From there he goes on to say, "Love one another as I have loved you." And there's a chain here that we need to pay attention to. We start with the Father's love, which is lavished upon Jesus. Jesus in turn loves his disciples with exactly the same sort of love. And then he tells us, "As I have loved you, you should love each other." But it all begins with the Father's love. As the Father has loved me. We won't get to loving one another as Jesus loved us if we don't understand how the Father loved Jesus. Do you understand what I'm saying? So we today want to think about, how did the Father love Jesus? What was it like? What did Jesus mean when he said, "The Father loves me, and I love the same way, love you the same way"? Let's think about this. How did the Father love Jesus? Well, yes, of course, they had a deep and intimate relationship. Jesus prayed regularly, and he addressed God as Father. And that was a revolutionary act for him to do that, to call God Father. Nobody around in those times was doing that. You could look through the whole Old Testament, and you never have any time when they address God as Father. And yet that was Jesus' constant name for Father. In fact, and we're meant to understand that we're talking about a deeper, more intimate relationship than than just simply calling him Lord. Not that that's a bad thing to call him. But Jesus wants us to understand that our relationship with God is a relationship between father and child. In fact, actually, he goes even deeper than we tend to think, because he uses his word for his relationship with God is Abba. That's the Aramaic word, the language that he spoke, and that word Abba, it really actually means not so much father as daddy. Jesus called God Daddy. And from there we are, I think, supposed to understand that the relationship that Jesus had with the Father was a deeply parental, intimate, loving relationship. And that's a wonderful thing. But we also need to remember, especially those of us who have had the experience of either being a child growing up in a household, or those of us who have been parents, and that includes all of us, is that parental love is about the most challenging and difficult kind of love that most of us will ever experience. How many can say amen to that? Amen. It's even more difficult than being married, right? If you want to be challenged in your life, become a parent. Because you will begin to understand that real love is a lot more complicated than we ever think that it will be. So, when we think about Jesus identifying God as his Abba, his daddy, we begin to understand that it's a deeply intimate relationship, but it's also a pretty complicated one, as all parental-child relationships are. Now, if this was just the sort of mushy, sentimental version of love that we so often think about, and that we think so often love is all about, that would be a little bit more comforting for us. But let's think again. How did the Father love Jesus? How did that love get itself lived out? Here's how the Father, the Daddy, loved Jesus. He had pushed Jesus out of the comfortable confines of heaven down to earth, where, as a baby, Herod tried to kill him, and he had to flee with his family as refugees into Egypt. The Father then sends him out to the wilderness for 40 days under assault by the devil, trying to get his claws into him. The Father loved Jesus by pressing him into conflict with self-righteous religious leaders and violent bureaucrats who plotted to put an end to him. And the Father loved him by surrounding him with friends who were complete knuckleheads, who never really understood what he was about, and who deserted Jesus at his greatest moment of need, when he most needed his friends. How did the Father love Jesus? Peril at every turn, demons to be cast out, the sick pulling on him, a woman yanking on the hem of his garment, crowds pressing in, no roof over his head, and then the worst conceivable end. That's how the Father loved Jesus. Which is how Jesus loves us. Which is how we are to love one another. We might wish that Jesus had said something else like, well, as the Father has loved me, well, I will spare you all of that. I will love you differently. I will let you live on an island of ease and weave a spell of protection around you so that you won't have to go through all the difficulties I had to go through. But no. Jesus' words of love are the same as the Father's. And if we abide in his love, we also may lose the roof over our heads. We will battle devils. People will think we are weird and strange. We won't get ahead in the world. We will be catapulted into serving in daunting places. Because like Jesus said, as the Father loved me, So I have loved you. And we are called to love one another as Christ has loved us. Now this might seem a strange sort of love, but because so often we think of love as merely being nice or tolerant or permissive. But even so, it is not entirely alien to most of us, especially if we had parental figures in our lives who truly loved us. Parental love, like I said, this was part of what Jesus was getting across when he called God Daddy, is often, as I said, the most difficult and demanding sort of love any of us will ever experience. But when we become parents, we are saying yes to a blind, unconditional commitment to the safety, nurture, and well-being of a precious human being who will for many years think we are trying to do just the opposite for them. But even more than that, we are also making a commitment to give these persons the resources so that they can become fully human in the best sense of that term, so that they might live fully into the person that God created them to be. When you become a parent, you become at least somewhat responsible for making sure that you do everything that you can, that your child fulfills every sort of possibility and every sort of potential that they have. Amen? Amen. And that's why we make so many hard decisions for our children, because we understand we are molding and shaping a human being that God has given us responsibility over. And that means sometimes we have to mold them in some ways that they don't like, that they don't appreciate. You see, that's how Jesus experienced the Father's love. Even at the very end, when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he was basically saying to his daddy, "Don't make me go through this." You ever had a child say that to you? Don't make me go to school. Don't make me go to the dentist. Don't make me return that candy bar that I stole. And that's the same thing that's going on. Jesus is being loved by his Father in such a way that the Father doesn't remove all the obstacles, doesn't make everything easy for Jesus, and says, "I am committed to doing whatever I can to make you fulfill your destiny as the Son of God and the Savior of the world." Well, that's not all our destiny, of course, but don't you feel that way, those of you who are parents? What wouldn't you do to help your child become all that God hoped for them to be? And that means even doing the hard things. That's love. You know, it reminds me of a story told by a fellow named Harold Wilkie. He is no longer with us, but he was a pastor, a wonderful pastor, and a wonderful advocate for disabled folks. He himself was disabled. He was born with no arms. And I was looking up a little bit of information about him. I saw a wonderful picture of him. He was in the garden, the Rose Garden, when President Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act. And because he had advocated for so long for this. And there's a picture of him. President Bush is handing off one of the pens that he'd signed the Americans with Disabilities Act. And there's Harold Wilkie with his bare foot reaching up to take that pen with his foot because he had no arms. Well, anyway, he tells the story of how when he was 3 or 4 years old, here's what he has to say. He says, "I was sitting on the floor in my bedroom trying to get a shirt over my head and around my shoulders and having an extraordinarily difficult time. I was grunting and sweating, and my mother just stood there and watched." Obviously, looking back on this now, I realize that my mother's arms must have been tightly at her side because every instinct in her wanted to reach out and do it for me. But she kept her arms tightly at her side. A neighbor who happened to be visiting said to my mother, "Why don't you help that child?" My mother responded through gritted teeth, I am helping him. That's love. And it reminds us, as I said before, that that's the way the Father loved Jesus. He loved Jesus not by making everything easy for him, not by making sure to rescue him out of any sort of trouble that he might encounter, but by letting him go through these difficult times. Because for the Father, loving Jesus meant helping him to fulfill his destiny as the fully human Messiah. And anything else than that would have been a failure for Jesus and a catastrophe for the world. Part of why we work so hard with our children is because we know the world needs more good people, don't we? And we don't want to be responsible for having another selfish, self-centered person coming out in the world, do we? There's enough of those. Many of them in high places. Amen? Amen. So maybe that's what love means for us today. Here at East Hartford, here at New Covenant United Methodist Church. Maybe to love one another as the Father loved Jesus means refusing the easy way out and fighting against everything that seeks to, or at least has the impact of dehumanizing and degrading our humanity. Standing beside and walking beside one another, saying, I will not let you be anything less than the full human being God created you to be. Children and youth, we are here for you, but don't expect that all we will do is pamper you and stand by and watch if you don't start going down ways that are destructive. Parents, we are here for you, and we want to help you make the tough and difficult decisions that love requires, and we want to support you in the stressful and difficult experience of having children and raising them. Parents, we want to be there with you. Spouses, we want to support you and strengthen your relationships with each other. And we will hold you to the promises you made to each other when you took your wedding vows. Because just like the Father did for Jesus, we want to love you. And love means that sometimes we will have to say and do things that don't look very much like what the world calls love. Or maybe it means something beyond even that. Maybe loving the people the way that the Father loved Jesus is about resisting everything, everywhere that stands in the way of people becoming fully human. And that means that we not only have to commit ourselves to the full humanity of the individuals around us, but we also have to be willing to look at the systems and the powerful collective forces that dehumanize and degrade and make it so difficult for entire groups of people to fulfill their potential. There's a powerful story that was told by Saul Alinsky. He tells the story of a group of people who are standing by a riverside, and they suddenly hear a baby crying. And shocked, they look out and they see an infant struggling in the water, and one person immediately dives in to rescue the child and is able to do so. But right away, right after that, another baby comes floating down the river, and then another. And pretty soon people all across the riverbanks are going out into the river to save these babies that are coming down the river. And then suddenly one person who has been helping folks do this gets out of the river bank, out onto the banks, and he starts walking upstream. And they're saying, what do you need? What are you doing that for? We need you here. And he's saying, I think I need to go upstream to find out who's putting all these babies in the river. You understand where I'm coming from, brothers and sisters? This is saying that while we want to make sure that we care for people who are going through difficult times, we also need to go upstream and make sure that we understand sometimes there are systems and structures and powerful people in powerful places holding other people down. And you're never going to get the babies to stop from coming down the river that you need to keep rescuing if you don't go to the source. As an example, I'm sure that many of us here this morning could talk about times when they've experienced dehumanization in the form of racist words and actions against them. And we need to resist those evil and these individual evil acts of racism. They are terrible, and they are horrible, and they demean, and we should not stand for it. But even so, that's like rescuing one baby floating down the river. It needs to be done. And it's important to do that. And you've got to have people in the river doing that. But after a while, we need to recognize that it's not just individual racists doing individual racist things, but there is a whole system that reinforces racism against people of color in this country. I'm talking about systems and structures and powers that turn a blind eye when unarmed black men are killed by the police. When black men can get tossed out of a Starbucks for just waiting too long for their friends. When black people cannot drive into certain neighborhoods without being tailed by the police or being pulled over for the crime of driving while black. When young black men consistently get longer sentences than young white men for the same crime. These are examples of not just one baby coming down the stream, but many babies floating down the stream. Babies we have invested our time and our love and our energy into. And somebody needs to stand up to those systems and say, no more. I've put too much into these people's lives. We have, as a church and as a community, have put too much to these people to see any one of them cut down or belittled or dehumanized because of the color of their skin. Friends, there's a wonderful thing that we need to understand, that many churches we're really good at doing the rescuing the one baby at a time. We're good at mercy. We're good at saying, oh, you're hurting? Let's help you. And we need to do that. But we're not so good at going upstream and saying to the powers that be, no more. You cannot run roughshod over other human beings. We will not let that happen. Well, there's one last thing. Jesus said that greater love has no man than this, that he would lay down his life for his friends. And we are hearing these words during the end of the season of Easter. We know how the story ends. We know Jesus suffered terribly, but God could not leave his son, the one he loves, his friend, in the grave. So one last thing, how did the Father love Jesus? On the third day, God raised him up. Which really tells us less about some automatic destiny we might have after we die than about how magnificent God really is. And if we think about it, we fall down on our faces and we laugh. Then we pick each other up and begin to sing some great chorus of praise to a God who loves like that. It's odd to be so hopeful, to hear what Jesus said the night before he was crucified and to hear it after Easter. Jesus' future invades that night, and the flicker of the candle really does banish the darkness. The disciples weren't going to be dying the next day, although they might have if they had been required to prove their friendship to Jesus. They're just called friends. They're simply deemed friends by Jesus. They have some number of years left to them, and the question Jesus knew they would harbor in their souls was this: so what do we do now that he's gone? Remember that last night he said, as the Father has loved me, so I love you, that he called us friends? Well, what do we do now? And remember, a lot of times love means doing the hard things for the sake of others. But also to remember that in the end, every sacrifice, every struggle that we've gone through for the sake of another human being winds up being for good. Every struggle is worth it. Because in the end, that same love that the Father loved Jesus with, that same love that Jesus loved us with, that same love that we are called to share with each other, wins. Love never fails. Agape love, that is. Love never fails. Amen.
Amen.